In his more than 40 years at the New York Times, David Sanger has covered the White House, national security, geopolitics, and cyber conflict. He's been part of reporting teams that won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, covered 5 presidents, and authored 4 books. The most recent of those is New Cold Wars: China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. That's one focus of his appearance tonight at the University of North Florida. David Sanger, thank you so much for being here.
And great to be back here in Jacksonville.
We're also joined by Britt Hester. He's Director of Communications for the World Affairs Council, which is hosting David Sanger's appearance. Hey, Britt.
Hey, Ann, how you doing?
Great. So, David, you are known as a reporter for the depth of your sources in the world of national security, for your in-depth investigations, your research, and you cover what I think of as probably one of the hardest beats in reporting, not just because of the usual challenges that go with reporting, but because the stuff that you're covering is supposed to stay super secret. It is, behind walls of national security, harder probably than most to get off the record or on the record comments.
And first of all, what we're covering is how America operates in the world. A world of competition, a world that involves dealing with Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and our allies, some of whom are contentious, some of whom are democracies, some of whom have days like South Korea had yesterday. And so while some of that involves classified material, um, really the big, broad categories of what we're doing don't. They're they're visible to you. The machinations behind the scenes, which illustrate what's going on, they may be harder to collect and report on, and that's the test of one's sources. But you should never um, overemphasize the importance of classified information because just because it's secret doesn't necessarily mean it's important. And just because it's important doesn't necessarily mean it's secret.
Your sourcing is well respected, and your interviews, you're talking to congressional people, congressmen, academics, foreign leaders. I've seen it said that you are the sort of national security and foreign policy writer whom politicians, diplomats, intelligence, and defense officials read not only to check their own quotes, but to find out what's really happening. That must be a enormous responsibility to know that you're delivering to some of the most powerful people in the world news to them.
Well, I wish I could say that that was like all about me. It's not. It's about the fact that I've worked for now 42 years plus for the New York Times. And, for all that you hear about uh, mainstream media, legacy media, so forth, leaders, decision makers around the world still pick up the New York Times, in the morning on their phones, listen to the daily, read our newsletters, all of the new forms of the New York Times for one reason, which is it's got unparalleled reporting. And that's true whether you're discussing culture or foreign affairs or domestic affairs and so forth. So I never want to confuse the fact that there people are talking to us and people are talking to me and people are reading us because of the overall environment of the Times. And the Times has given me great leeway over the past 4 decades and a press pass to the world that I think is both a great responsibility, but also you wake up every day saying to yourself, "How can I explain this set of events to readers who are busy and on their way to work and commuting and so forth, and make sure they understand not only what's happening but the dynamics behind it."
In addition to your 42 years, you have sort of a familial link to the New York Times radio, right? Back in the day.
Do. My, grandfather, Elliot M. Sanger, was the co-founder of WQXR, which was the first, classical music FM station, or one of the first in the country, and one of the biggest, and was owned by the Times from 1945 until probably 10 or 15 years ago. It's now part of, New York Public Radio. But the result is that my grandfather, sort of, I by the time I was growing up, he was retired, but I was, hearing the stories of operating in and around the newsroom of the Times.
Yeah. So I'm curious, just in terms of the job that you have, you are, traveling with the president very often on Air Force One, you're attending conferences, speeches, and I think just trying to keep up. I mean, we were talking before the show, just in the last 72 hours, there's been this tumult in France over the leadership of the prime minister there. What you were referring to in South Korea, this declaration of martial law that seemed to catch everybody on their back foot globally. How do you even keep, I mean, those are people that we're thinking of as sort of stable allies of the United
Yeah.
States.
Well, there's not a whole lot stable in the world these days, and, I, was at another World Affairs Council event last night, and I reminded everybody that the world that Donald Trump is about to go inherit in 6 weeks is very different from the world he left on January 2021. And I'm not sure to what degree the new team has sort of absorbed those differences. I mean, the easy thing to say would be, it was all fine when we left and, Joe Biden messed it all up. And you can argue about what Biden was responsible for and what he wasn't. But the fact of the matter is, the dynamics have changed considerably in the East, with China in particular. Certainly with Russia, the invasion of Ukraine was in February of 2022, so it was a year and a month after Biden came in. Uh, and that wasn't about Joe Biden, that was about Vladimir Putin. So the big question, I think, is how well do they land on their feet and get going? And, it helps in the fact that President Trump and his aides have been through this for 4 years, and they know a lot more than they knew, when he came in after the 2016 election, but they may be surprised about how different the world looks to them today.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to New York Times White House and national security correspondent David Sanger. He's in town tonight as part of the World Affairs Council Global Issues Series. You can join our conversation as well. You can call us at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org or reach out on social media. So we noted you'll be speaking tonight, David, as part of a speaker series at UNF with the World Affairs Council. The topic of your book is going to be also the topic of your talk. It's titled "The New Cold Wars." Talk to us about who is participating in the new Cold Wars. Why is it a plural? How is it
Sure.
different from the original Cold War?
Well, thanks, Anne, because that S is really important. The old Cold War was primarily a military competition, and within that, a nuclear competition with one adversary, the old Soviet Union. And while it had its terrifying moments, and while it had its proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam and so forth, over time it settled into something of a predictable pattern. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, both sides were terrified enough that they settled into a world in which the United States understood that if it did X, the Soviet response would probably be Y. The Soviets had a similar understanding. There was a big red phone on either side. They had a pretty good thought that if they picked it up, someone would answer at the other end, and they'd probably know who the person was who was answering at the other end. And we were dependent on the old Soviet Union for nothing. Well, that's not true. Vodka and caviar, I think, could have been, 2 notable exceptions, but, if we had to live without them, we probably could figure out a way. The new Cold Wars are a completely different dynamic. We are obviously in a heated, direct conflict over Ukraine that we're trying to keep from spreading elsewhere, but which, is increasingly worrisome. Uh, and we are in a multi-front competition that could well spill out into confrontation with China. China is the only country that can be our military, economic, cultural, and technological competitor. It's the only one that can really do that. And in many ways, one has to worry about the fact that our obsession with um, Putin's disruption can distract from the more subtle issues with China. And more worrisome than that is the two countries are now coming together. And that wasn't even evident to President Biden at the beginning of his administration. I asked him about it flat out at a press conference in maybe a year into his presidency, and he said, "Oh, David, these are two countries that have never gotten along. I don't think this is going to be an issue." By his last press conference, which was after the NATO conference in July and may turn out to be the last press conference of his presidency, I asked him if he had a policy of trying to get in the way of China and Russia, the way Nixon and Kissinger did in 1972 with the opening to China, which was motivated by an effort to divide China and the old Soviet Union. And he said, "Yes, I do, but I'm not going to tell you the details." Well, many of the details are in New Cold Wars. And this is a completely different dynamic. And in many ways, it's a far more dangerous dynamic because we don't understand the scope of the relationship between these two nuclear superpowers. Obviously, North Korea and Iran have sided with them in various ways. And it's becoming evident that with the end of globalization, we're getting a new iron curtain that is dropping. Some of it is digital, some of it's in trade, some of it is physical, but we're in for 30 or 40 years of confrontation, I argue in the book. And if you believe that, it changes everything you think about how much we're going to have to spend on defense, what our nuclear strategy is going to have to be, what our technology strategy is going to have to be, how artificial intelligence may affect the capabilities of all of these superpowers. And the book is an effort to try to get Americans to sort of get on the page about a new era that they're in.
You also talk about how there was a point during that period where perhaps countries didn't have to openly align with one or the other, that they could kind of play the middle field.
There are a
Countries
lot of
like,
countries doing that right now.
but that is changing.
Well, look at India, which look at a close ally like Singapore. Um, Small, but strategically very important. Um, these are countries that say, and there's a chapter in the book that's titled this way, "Don't make me choose." In other words, don't make me choose between the China Russia nexus and the United States. And you'll notice there are 50 or 60 countries that have joined the US European side of the Ukraine war, but there are 100 countries that haven't, and they're trying to, work both sides of it. They're selling oil to the Chinese. They don't want to get their business, in the way of this. Where this really comes down to confrontation and is in technology. Because while you can sort of move between the two in most areas, when it comes to choosing whether you're going to have a US dominated or Western dominated telecommunication system or a China Huawei dominated one, whether it comes to whose chips you're going to buy, whether or not you're going to respect the U.S. export controls against Russia and China or not. When it comes to that, you basically have to choose. And countries are not comfortable with that. But that's the world we're headed into.
You talk about basically the full period of my adult life as a holiday from history. And I think that that's an interesting point to dig into a little bit. I mean, you described the period between the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and then the invasion of the Russian invasion, um, as a kind of this lacuna between periods that are going to be very much defined by conflict. Uh, and I think that for a lot of people, they've sort of forgotten what it is like to live in a zone defined by that much international hostility.
Well, we've got a generation and a half of people who grew up, not in that era. So you've gotten to one of the reasons I wanted to write New Cold Wars. Um, 30 years ago this year, I came back from my happy life as a New York Times foreign correspondent in Asia. I was based in Japan for 6 years and traveling around Asia. and landed in Washington. This was October of 1994. And as I look back at that period now, there was one unchallenged assumption across parties around the city and really around the Western Alliance, which is that Russia and China, each for their own reasons, would basically join Western institutions. That China desperately wanted to be in the World Trade Organization because it needed to trade with the United States and its allies. That Russia was broke and on its back and just needed to keep the oil flowing to Europe because that was the only thing it had going that was revenue producing. And the theory was that this gave the sole superpower at the time, the United States, enormous powers to shape the world. And we acted that way for a while. I mean, we could lift bombers off in Nebraska and go drop ordnance in the war in Bosnia and Serbia, um, and have the pilots come back and land and go have dinner with their families. No other country had that kind of reach. Um, there was, dismantlement of, huge amounts of the nuclear arsenal, not all of it, but we went from more than 10,000 weapons deployed on each side to 1,550. That's a big diminishment. People stopped thinking about nuclear weapons. I teach national security. Most students I get have never been in a course that dealt with nuclear strategy once in their lives, which would not have been the case. I'm revealing my advanced age here. When I was going to school in the late '70s and early '80s. Um, so the question I wanted to ask in the book was, what happened here? Was this an intelligence failure? Was it wishful thinking? Was it that wonderful American capability to assume that every other country is driven by what we're driven by, which is profit motive? And therefore, as Donald Trump would frequently say in his first term, oh, yeah, they'll turn around because they're we're going to break them with sanctions and, it'll force them to come to the table. Well, how have those sanctions on Iran done since he pulled out of the deal? They've got closer to a nuclear weapon than they've ever been. How did it do with North Korea? They've got 60 nuclear weapons now. Uh, how did it do with China, which has learned how to evade U.S. sanctions? The Russians have the Russians could hold a master class in avoiding sanctions and working their way around it. So we needed to have a real rethink. And the fact of the matter is that the past couple of years have shown we weren't a holiday from history.
There was this phrase, "the end of history," that was bandied about and as you suggest, sort of embraced the idea that, all of these developments, whether it was globalization or technology, would sort of create a unified vision that would kind of override nationalism and override territorial ambitions.
That's right. Francis Fukuyama, I think, sort of coined that phrase in a foreign affairs article and then a book called The End of History, which basically suggested that everybody was moving toward liberal democracies. And first of all, he wasn't the only one. So, and he's a pretty brilliant scholar. So I'm not blaming him. And the second is, as I said, this was sort of a universally accepted thought. It just happened to be, as it turned out, completely wrong. Okay. And, South Korea, which we were discussing before, that was the great example of the end of history. I mean, here was a country that was a US ally, but basically run by military dictators from the end of the Korean War up until the 1980s when a wealthy, increasingly wealthy and assertive populace took to the streets, ousted the autocrats, and made its conversion to a great democracy and is now one of the most critical US allies in dealing with China. And I think one of Biden's greatest accomplishments was actually bringing South Korea and Japan, which have, 150 years of or longer of historical animosity, actually hundreds of years of animosity, together in that effort. Um, and then yesterday, we had this, flashback for 6 hours to the past where the president of South Korea declares martial law, not because of a great North Korea threat, although he made a vague reference to that, but because there's political gridlock with his National Assembly. And what happened? The uprising was so fast, and the markets were so poised to just pummel what is now the world's 12th largest economy. I mean, South Korea is no minor player in the world economy. And by the way, Samsung makes chips we can't make, right? And so is a critical supplier to us. And the martial law lasted 5.5, 6 hours. And on the one hand, that was a great triumph of democracy. On the other hand, it was like a reminder of how fragile democracies are.
When you talk about assumptions, like assumptions about, you know, people divesting themselves of national identities or, being incorrect about that end of history, you also in your book talk about other assumptions that we've made that were equally blind, whether it's, what would happen after we left Afghanistan or the idea that Russians would not move beyond their existing borders to
Right.
claim parts of Europe. What other assumptions are we making currently that you think are going to be problematic? Is it impossible to forecast what we're doing currently that is blind to the future?
Well, my forecasting abilities are pretty poor, particularly when it comes to American politics. So I'm not sure I'd be a great expert out there. But there are some things that I worry about for this. Number one, we assumed and actually still do assume that our supply chains of technology around the world and of critical parts are going to basically remain flowing. And we got a rude awakening during COVID and maybe a good warning when we suddenly discovered that things as basic as surgical masks and, N95s and all that, or even just the precursors that you need to make vaccines, we needed to get from abroad and we suddenly couldn't get them. Remember those cars that would be lined up, in empty lots because there were certain chips you couldn't get for the dashboard and therefore
Yeah.
you couldn't sell the car. Um, and that started, I think, a very admirable effort by the Biden administration to not only deprive China of the most advanced artificial intelligence related technology, chips, the chip making equipment, so that we could try to retain or gain more of a lead, but also to bring some of that home and to begin to build more chips in the United States. My criticism of the administration and of Congress in the book is that they're not moving anywhere near fast enough. And so if you're looking for an assumption that we're making right now that I worry about, we are assuming that China so needs the chips that are made in Taiwan by Taiwan Semiconductor, the largest, most highly capitalized company in Asia, and the most critical supplier for what's in your iPhone and for NVIDIA's AI chips and so forth. We're assuming that we're still going to have access to that, and it's a little bit of a crazy assumption. I mean, if it they are building all of this because a series of US companies made a series of business decisions with no national security thinking whatsoever that we were gonna move the manufacturing to a very efficient producer and just design the chips here in the United States. And it made every bit of economic sense. But if I came to you and said, "Here's an idea. Let's take 90 to 95% of the most advanced chips that we need the most, and let's manufacture them on an island 100 miles off of China that the Chinese want back." You'd probably tell me that wasn't the brightest idea you ever heard. And in fact, it isn't. And we need to be moving at vastly, vastly greater speeds to get to the level of independence that we need.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to New York Times reporter David Sanger ahead of his appearance tonight in Jacksonville. You can join our conversation at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org. I want to take a call from Sally in Springfield. Good morning, Sally. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Sanger, for the work that you do. I have a question. And what is your perspective on President-elect Trump's recent talk about Canada becoming the next state for America? He posted an AI photo of him standing on the edge of a mountain next to a big Canadian flag, looking at supposedly the mountains of Canada. And I just wanted to address this, and especially since we're talking about assumptions that we have two peaceful allies, one above and one below. This kind of presentation or talk, whatever you want to call it, is unsettling.
I confess I did not see that tweet and have not seen a picture of.
Yeah, I'm just
Uh,
seeing that apparently he was joking with Justin Trudeau about annexing Canada.
oh, was he? Okay. Well, I'm a fly fisherman, and I can tell you that they've got some of the best trout streams around, but I don't think it's in the cards.
Yeah, all right. Fair enough. We've got a call from Susan in Mandarin. Good morning, Susan. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that very clear example about the island and everything. But my question, and I hope other people want to know the answer to this also, but what would be a good use of tariffs? I know Adam Smith, a long time ago in the 1700s, was speaking out against tariffs because of the way that they were being used. But are there some good uses of tariffs? Thank you.
It's a really good question. So I think we have to look at this a couple of different ways. As I suggested at the beginning, China, in particular, is a military and economic and technological threat. And during the campaign, and for this I blame both campaigns, both the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign, there was absolutely no discussion, zero discussion of a broad grand strategy for how we want to go deal with China. And when it came up for President Trump, his answer to everything was tariffs. Um, there are moments when you may want to use tariffs strategically to protect a burgeoning American industry. President Biden, um, who would describe himself as largely a free trader, although he'd probably say fair trader, put a 100% tariff on the import of Chinese-made automobiles. The Chinese cars aren't even here in the U.S. market yet. It was a preemptive tariff in order to keep the U.S. auto industry from suffering at the hands of subsidized and much lower cost Chinese goods. Um, there was talk during the competition with Japan in the 1980s of putting tariffs on Japanese car parts, and there were some tariffs on specific things. We've seen tariffs used on Chinese-made solar panels along the way.
And you think those various examples were wise?
You can, at various moments, as a temporary measure, make that work if you are actively building up your own industry and if you believe that the other country is acting in a predatory way to basically destroy your industry before it gets going. And I can understand short-term uses. That's not what I understand President Trump is describing. He's describing broad tariffs that would be used against allies and adversaries. He's not talking about a specific time limit. And he's also not talking about what its inflationary effects would be. And frankly, I know the president says frequently that, it's the Chinese who pay the tariffs. It's not. It's you and me that pay the tariffs, right? Because that price increase goes right in. So when the inflation result of that begins to take off, my guess is that the consumer's enthusiasm for tariffs may wane a little bit.
But I mean, if you rescind tariffs, does that have any immediate impact, or does that inflationary effect just kind of kick in and remain?
It can, because manufacturers are accustomed to passing on a higher price, and they may just decide, well, we'll just, fatten our profits with it. So it's risky. The president does have, under US law, extraordinary discretionary power to impose tariffs without Congress's assent.
So tonight you're going to be talking about your new book, The New Cold Wars, but I just want to talk a little bit about your previous book, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, because we've been hearing a lot lately about these various quote unquote typhoons. That's the cyber name assigned to, hacks that originate in China.
Right.
So we're continuing to learn about the presence of some, malware or, invasion of all kinds of high level systems, whether it's, infrastructure or emails and texts that the president or the future president may have sent or received. How broad is it? What do we know about the extent of this?
So, as The Perfect Weapon described, and that book came out in 2018, and there was an HBO documentary on it that we brought out in 2020 that your listeners may want to go dig up if they have HBO. You can still find it there. That sort of describes the origins of how this came about. But cyber is the place where you conduct short of war aggression against other countries. And the 2 typhoons that we're most worried about right now, one of them, which the US has been dealing with for the past year and a half, called Volt Typhoon, and one of them that is much more recent this summer called Salt Typhoon, really illustrate the differences. Volt Typhoon was an effort by the Chinese intelligence agencies to put code into the utility grid, into the water supply systems, and so forth, so that if there was ever a confrontation over Taiwan, they would have the power to turn off um, uh, a good deal of the utility grid, slow our response. So that would be an offensive use of cyber to basically have a physical effect in the United States. Um, Salt Typhoon is quite different. It's been an espionage effort that has gotten deep inside the US telecommunications world and probably enabled the Chinese, among other things, to figure out which Chinese spies the United States was onto and wasn't, because they got into the court approved system for doing surveillance.
Which could really put some people at risk if
Hey,
they're working.
that's right. Huge counterintelligence problem. And that gives you the scope, the amount of money, time, expertise the Chinese have put into this.
Brett Hester, I just want to bring you in briefly with the World Affairs Council. You obviously have David in tonight at 7 o'clock at UNF to talk about some of these issues. But what is it that he brings to this series that you guys are presenting?
Yeah, so the World Affairs Council, of course, exists to bring the world closer. And so we try to offer a broad range of topics that people are interested in. And obviously, what's going on in the world in relation to China and Russia, this is on the forefront of many of our listeners' minds. And so, this is a great opportunity for you to come and hear from one of those leading voices. And we encourage people to go to our website, worldaffairscounciljax.org. They can find tickets. It's free and open to the public, but we certainly hope that people will take a look as well at our membership options so that they can hear not only from David, but from other speakers that we have in our lineup throughout the season.
And David, you're going to be speaking and then also signing books.
That's what I understand. And it's really great to be back. I haven't actually spoken back in Jacksonville since my second book came out in around 2010, 2011. So it's been a while, and it's great to be back. And I'm really delighted that we're going to have a lot of students there in particular.
Well, it's great to talk to you. David Sanger, thank you so much for being here. Brett Hester, thanks for coming as well.
Thank you, and